Welcome to the Strategic Leader podcast with me, Gemma Bullivant, and my co-host, Fiona Craig. This podcast is for HR professionals and people-focused leaders from any function who want to think, act, and feel naturally more strategic. Enjoy the show. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Strategic Leader podcast. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for tuning in. Hi Fee, how are you?
Hi Gem, I'm very well. I'm just getting over a cold, but we're feeling good. How about you?
I'm good, thank you. Now, I know the first question on everybody's minds who listened to the last episode is, how was the holiday?
I thought you'd never ask. The holiday was great. Thank you very much. I was skiing, blue sky, white snow, perfect. And I'm really going to have to stop myself from talking about it even more. Lovely sense of perspective in a ski resort. We've talked
Yeah.
about perspective quite a lot on this podcast, and definitely that sense of how small am I in this big landscape I'm in definitely has links to, us encouraging people to think strategically.
Great. And did you manage to switch off from active thinking and let your brain just do a little bit of its own kind of processing in its own time whilst you were shushing down those slopes?
I did, very much. Definitely a state of flow was achieved mentally, if not necessarily physically all the time. But yeah, definitely it's one of those holidays where there's enough for your brain to think about in the here and now, which is where am I going to go left? Where am I going to go next? What time is lunch? And that sort of fills up your headspace. And there's not really any space for anything more important. And that for me is very relaxing, very restorative place to be, because my brain is sort of occupied quite lightly. So there's not that kind of empty space for these big existential questions to creep in. What am I doing with my life? So on.
As polar opposite, I had a very searching coaching conversation with a client last week, and it was in a good way, stretching in a good way.
Yeah.
Made me think. We were talking about gravitas.
There's a
And
word.
what is gravitas? The frame of the conversation was broadly, as you might imagine, because I'm bringing it to our podcast today, is how to be more strategic. What do I need to think about in order to be more strategic? But the word gravitas cropped up in our conversation, and we talked about it for a little while. And then my coachee asked me quite directly, and hats off to her for doing this, how would you define gravitas?
And how would you define gravitas?
Well, in my inimitable way, I bumbled my way through a
Mm.
few broad terms
Bit of
and
this and sort of
descriptions.
that.
And it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's how you show up. It's different for everyone. We've got different versions of it. It's about our impact, the way in which people might feel influenced by us. It's linked to confidence. It's linked to just having something that means that people sit up and listen to us.
I think that's a very helpful alternative to the word gravitas, which I actually think is a pretty useless word. Shall I give you a definition? And I say this because I have been told in the past, I mean a long time ago, that I need to work on my gravitas, which I gravely nodded at and then scurried away to go and do just that, and then realised I didn't have a clue what it meant. But I'm looking it up now. And the definition is dignity, seriousness, or solemnity of manner. And similar words given include loftiness and grandeur. And I don't love
Well,
that definition.
that's not how we use it
No,
in
it
our
isn't.
everyday parlance, is it?
It isn't. So I wonder whether people use it as a bit of a clumsy shortcut for all of those things you mentioned,
Mm,
culminating in, do I have the capacity to get people to listen to me? Sit up and pay attention if I've got
mm,
something to say. I think that's a much more useful summary of what we're talking about here,
mm,
because that's easier to break down and go, okay, well, what goes into that than that word gravitas, which is a little bit like grandeur, loftiness, solemnity.
Things that it made me think about was how we define it ourselves. Because I asked her, well, how would you define gravitas? You've recruited people, you've used the term, as we all have in our professional lives, we've used the term or heard the term gravitas, but what would be your definition of it? Hmm. And it led us on to a conversation about what then we notice about people that we might consider to have gravitas. What are we
Mm.
looking for as clues? And we landed on this concept of active or strategic curiosity.
Nice. Go on.
And the reason that we landed on that as an area to explore more was because I think that people who are actively curious, are showing an interest in other people, are bringing people into their world. They actively want to know a bit more about what's going on for them, what their perspective is. That's creating this sense of trust, this sense of relationship building. It's helping that person feel heard, and it's allowing some of our knowledge sharing to actually be a little bit more about inquiry as well.
And I think that's a really interesting topic, isn't it? Because we have this sense when we get to more senior tables that our value is measured by the kind of expertise that we bring to the table, the telling. I need to know what I'm talking about because I need to perhaps in some way persuade you that I know what I'm talking about or that my approach is right. But that's not the only way of bringing value into a conversation or a meeting or a team. So that notion of inquiry and curiosity can be of huge value to a team or a meeting or a conversation,
Mm.
in addition to knowledge. It's almost the opposite of knowledge sharing, isn't it? It's knowledge seeking. And a really good strategic conversation will have both of those things in it.
It's like coaching, isn't it? In the sense that a coach asks questions in order to understand better, and that enables you to establish the facts, establish exactly what we do know and don't know about a situation, helps us to establish what we need to know more about, that we may not have all of the facts when we
Mm.
come to a meeting. We may have some superficial facts and then some areas that we now know we need to go and understand a bit better before we can make any intelligent decisions about this particular topic. And we also need to get comfortable with the idea that a good question is just as valuable, if not more valuable, than a good piece of input or knowledge about a particular topic.
I agree. I really very much agree with that. And I also think a really good question is often very welcomed by everyone around the table. We've probably all been in too many meetings where people are just desperate to share their knowledge. And that's a kind of one-way street, which sometimes it's vital, sometimes it's interesting, but often it's not, right? It's sort of a cul-de-sac. And asking really good questions prompts us to think, it prompts us to debate and discuss, prompts us to learn, prompts us to reflect, which I think is much more interesting, potentially much more powerful. One really, really good question, which is, what is the most difficult thing about this for us today? Or how does this whole conversation relate to what we're trying to achieve? Or, who is missing from this conversation that would help us resolve this? Any of those kind of big questions can bring so much value in, more so than somebody who's got vast amounts of subject matter expertise.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be boring if a meeting was just people telling you everything they know about a topic?
Well,
I feel like I've been to a few of those meetings.
yeah, we've definitely been to a few of those. Thinking about gravitas, being a subject matter expert might be part of that. Like, this person clearly knows what they're talking about. But that's not the full picture, is it? It's definitely this person can poke a stick at this and ask the slightly uncomfortable question. This person can actually move us forwards. This person can demonstrate their grip on this entire conversation, not just the subject matter, but, are we talking about the right stuff? Are we moving forward at the right pace? Are we going to get what we need to get out of this conversation by the end of the meeting? Somebody who can reflect on the conversation that we're having as well as the content of that conversation.
Absolutely. And when you think about it, it is one of the most natural things in communication is the art of asking questions. Most conversations, most everyday conversations involve questions and answers. We don't go around monologuing to each other without questions that we ask each other.
Well, some people do.
So this notion that when you go to an executive meeting or a senior meeting where you are expected to operate at quite a strategic level, this notion that you go to these meetings we're armed with lots of monologues and facts about
Mhm,
a particular topic and no questions whatsoever, that questions in some way might demonstrate a lack of knowledge and a weakness, and therefore I better not ask that question or I might look a bit silly,
mhm, mhm.
is not a valid perspective to take,
I
generally
think
speaking.
yeah, I agree it's not, but it does happen. I think we've all been in a situation where we've thought, "I really need to ask a question here," but it's a really daft question. It will reveal how much I don't know. It will reveal how stupid I am if I ask that question. I guess I've wrestled with myself quite a lot on this one in the past and just got to the stage that I am willing to put money on the fact that there is somebody else in this room that is also thinking exactly the same. Or that if I phrase the question correctly, it will move us forward, it won't move us backwards.
Mm,
That's a real kind of lump in our mindset that we have to kind of get over, because there is that notion that if I ask a question, it reveals the fact that I don't know something. But we need curiosity, we need to ask questions. In any kind of business context, asking questions and being able to listen really well builds trust. Well, A, it's a great source of learning. We need to learn about our situations. We need to learn about our clients. And we need to learn about challenges and issues that everyone has. Anyone we work with needs to feel heard by us in order to build trust and relationships. It's part of the glue that holds all our relationships together. And how do we anticipate the needs of our stakeholders or our clients if we don't understand what they are? And how do we understand what they are if we don't ask them?
mm, mm.
So we have to be willing to ask questions in order to A, learn, B, build relationships. And it would be nice if there was a C, but it's not on the tip of my tongue. It will come, I'm sure. And
Innovate. That would be
yeah,
C.
yeah, find answers.
Because there'll be other it will prompt a question will prompt other inputs or other ideas, or a question might prompt the person to articulate what they've just said in a slightly different way that then opens up some different ideas. So I think there's definitely some innovation that can be had from questions as well.
Yeah, and with innovation, I would also include insight, and we know that as coaches, which is that if you ask a good question at the right moment, well, the right question at the right moment, and you can never predict what that question is going to be,
Mm,
it generates reflection and often, therefore, insight. So it gets somebody to somewhere they wouldn't have got without that question.
mm,
So there are some risks that come, I think, with being curious.
mhm,
And sometimes those risks can hold us back a little bit, I think. If we ask a question, it does take us into the realm of the unknown, because presumably we don't know the answer to that question, which is why we're
mm,
on. And so that can take us into a spectrum where we're not entirely in control of what happens next. And if you feel like you have to be the expert and have to be in control of the whole thing, you have to control or choreograph the conversation, then asking questions opens up a space where you're not going to be in control. You don't know what the answer is going to be. And along with that, we are having to put aside our own judgments because we may find out that we are wrong about some assumptions that we're making, or we may find some information that actually we find a little bit uncomfortable.
mhm,
Asking a really good question may reveal something that I might be doing wrong or have done suboptimally, or that what I'm doing has impact on somebody else that is undesirable. So I have to be willing to put growth over comfort when I ask a question. Not all the time, but
yes.
occasionally I have to be willing to hear something that maybe I would prefer not to hear, but is quite necessary. But that's what I mean about being in that sort of space of the unknown. I don't know what I'm gonna get back.
I don't know what I'm going to get back, and I don't know if I'll be able to handle what I get back, which
Yeah,
comes up as well, doesn't it?
yeah,
Because
yeah.
it's all part of this sense of control, the comfort zone versus growth zone idea, where we are starting to get into unknown territory, and we don't really know if we're going to be able to deal with the answers to the questions that come back. I think that's what's coming to my mind when you're talking there.
Mhm,
Being comfortable with the not knowing is a really powerful skill to adopt. And it might be that we just need to take some baby steps with that to build confidence, to ask some questions on the basis that we are going to demonstrate active curiosity. And curiosity is a strategic leadership skill. So it is a legitimate thing for me to do, to be actively curious. Because let's remember, if we're actively curious, we are demonstrating that we're interested, that we want to know more, we want to understand better, and we want to see things from potentially another person's perspective. So it's a completely valid and actually essential strategic leadership skill to have. So if we can give ourselves the permission, I use that phrase a lot, but give ourselves the permission to ask questions, we then go into the territory of feeling comfortable that we may not know what to do with what comes back,
mhm, mhm.
and perhaps have a little bit of language up our sleeve that just enables us to acknowledge what's come back. Maybe we've got some follow-up questions about what comes back.
Yeah,
I mean, a classic is, "Oh, tell me a bit more," to give yourself a little bit more
yeah,
time
yeah.
to process what you're hearing.
So that notion that asking a question isn't just the words coming out of your mouth, it's kind of the mindset or the presence that you have to bring to what the answer may be, because I have to hear what the answer is, and sometimes it's a very functional answer, but if it is something that impacts on me, I might have to have the presence to say, "Okay, I'm not going to get defensive about what I've just heard, or I'm not gonna instantly react to what I've just heard. I'm just gonna absorb it." And that's, I think, where you're talking about language might be like, "Okay, let me just go away and have a think about that before I respond to that." Or, "Just say a little bit more about what you mean before I react." Just putting those little gaps in
Hmm.
to enable us to stay in that curious place when actually our sort of ancient brains might be firing into defensive mode or reactive mode. We might just need to consciously bring some presence to bear and say, "Hold on, let's just keep learning. Let's just stay curious. Let's not judge what has been said. Let's just stay with it."
It's that active listening mantra of listening to understand, not to respond,
Yes.
isn't it? I can't remember it now, but there are levels of active listening
Yes.
whereby, depending on where you are on that level, you're not hearing anything at all. I've just said I can't remember it now, and I'll probably now reel it off. Um, you're not even paying any attention, or you're hearing aspects. The sort of the level two, I think, is like the cocktail party effect. You tune into certain words, you hear your name, you hear something
Yeah.
that you might that your brain, your RAS is sort of tuned into the part of your brain that just allows you to filter some useful information. Or that I think level three is something, correct me if I've got this wrong. Level three is something along the lines of seeking to hear the thing that you want to hear. So you're in the
Yes.
conversation and it's almost that confirmation bias. Level four, I think, is listening with more intent, but it's still with the intent to reply. It's with the intent to actually have an answer back or
Mhm.
have a
Mm.
follow on in
Yeah.
response to that. And that's a really difficult one to get out of because of this art of conversation, which
Mm.
is actually a conversation has to have a bit of two-way about it. So we've become very accustomed to having an answer and having to do that quite in the moment. But level five, which is the top level, is truly listening to hear and understand what that person is saying, not necessarily to have an answer to it, but to understand it.
Mhm.
Have I got that right?
Well, I've no idea. It all sounds very sensible to me. I've got a couple of builds on that now that you've said it. Whether these are actually logical levels or not, I don't know. But the way I sometimes think about it is, listening for the gap in the conversation when someone's going to take a breath, because that's when I know that I can come back in, which is basically not listening at all, is it? Because I'm just waiting for a gap.
That's level
And
3.
I'm preparing my answer. So I'm not really listening. So let's not confuse that with listening. Maybe there's some hearing going on, because again, I'm waiting for that gap. Then I like to think of it as, we can listen for data, which maybe is that cocktail party thing or that confirmation bias thing, which is like, I'm listening for some key information about, okay, well, there's going to be another meeting on Wednesday at 2:00, but I'm not really listening for meaning. So listening for meaning is a different thing, which is, what do you actually mean? I hear the words that you said,
Mm.
but what do you mean? Really listening for what you mean might come from a whole bunch of different sources. So for example, it might come from what you're not saying. It might come from some sort of incongruence between what you're saying, the words that are coming out of your mouth, and how you're acting. So if
Mhm.
you're saying, "Yeah, I totally agree," but you've got your arms crossed and you're frowning and you're looking down, then maybe
Mm.
you don't actually really agree, and I could be wise to that meaning. Can I listen to where you pause? Could I listen to any interesting turns of phrases or metaphors or unusual language that you use? All of those things can help me pick out your meaning, even if you're not actually using those words. So we need to be listening. Active listening is more than just hearing, isn't it? It's putting meaning to the data. And
It is.
that comes from all of those different things, plus a level of our intuition, which, if I'm really, really paying you attention, and this only comes in, this intuition only comes in if I'm really paying you attention. What am I picking up from in my gut?
And then also checking what you're picking up, which is one of those classic check for understanding activities that maybe we've heard about or learnt about. We certainly have as coaches, but in I know it's something that is talked about in leadership skills as well. Using phrases like, "I think what I'm hearing is," and playing
Yeah.
back
Yeah.
something, a version of your understanding of what you've just heard. And that can be one of those useful things to have up your sleeve that I was referring to earlier, because you can always do a bit of playback on the spot, because you
Yes.
can always recap a version of what you've just heard to check that your version is what they wanted you to hear and that you haven't misinterpreted something. It sometimes helps the person that's been doing the answering of the questions to hear it back and go, yeah, kind of is what I said, but that isn't what I meant, and then they can they can they can have another go at it.
Yeah.
But it's deepening your understanding of the topic in such a way that it's helpful to the room. It's helpful to the room to get that
Yeah.
kind of level of understanding.
It can be very helpful to the room, and I think particularly extroverts do their thinking out loud often, which means that
Mm,
they'll be very happy to start talking before they've really fully figured out what it is they want to say. So the act of talking is the processing of, what do I mean? And so for
mm,
somebody then to reflect back a summary of what we've just heard can actually be incredibly helpful for an extrovert, as you say, because they can either go, yes, that's exactly what I mean, it's that, or do you know, now that you've played it back, I actually don't think it's that, I think it's something else.
mm,
Um, so it can be useful just for the purpose of gaining collective agreement, but it can also be useful for certain thinking styles to summarize or say, this is what I've heard, without judgment. One of my favorite expressions, I would say I use it once a week at least, is, you can't have curiosity and judgment present at the same time. You're either in a state of curiosity or you're in a state of judgment. So if you're summarizing or reflecting back or saying, this is what I've heard, are you coming from an intention of curiosity? I want to check my understanding here. I want to, offer this to the group to say, is this right? Is this where we want to be, for example? Or I'm judging it, which is like, so are you really telling me that what you've just said is X, Y, and Z? Is that what you really mean?
mm,
But, that carries a lot of judgment with it, which is like,
mm.
I'm sort of saying I think you're wrong, or the argument is weak or something. So curiosity and judgment can't really be present at the same time. Where are you coming from? Am I genuinely in a position of curiosity, which is, tell me what you think? So yeah, that's another thing just to keep in your head. Am I asking this question from a position of curiosity or from a position of judgment.
That's a great way of looking at it. I like that link with curiosity and judgment. What I'm hearing, just to do a little bit of reflective playback, is is that it is an a legitimate strategic skill to be actively curious. Strategic curiosity is a thing. What's come up in lots of conversations I've had with clients in the past, and I'm sure that will keep cropping up, is how can I be more strategic in a meeting when I don't know what, all the ins and outs of what the people there are talking about, or I don't have any further knowledge to contribute. My answer to that is contribute with some questions that are going to move the conversation forward or deepen your understanding and the understanding of everyone else in the room. That will show some strategic insight, some act of strategic thinking just in contributing in that way rather than contributing with facts and figures and further input and content to the conversation.
I think that's absolutely right. That touches upon impact. I'm showing up with curiosity. I'm showing up with intent. I'm showing up with the ability to listen, the ability to question, the ability to challenge, the ability to learn. All of these things, hugely beneficial strategic traits. And also, if you are, I don't know, if you are nervous, if you are reluctant to speak up, if you are feeling like your voice isn't as valuable as all the other ones in the room, then asking questions, a really, really good question, it can have very few words in it. The attention will only be on you for a moment or two, and then everyone will be deep in contemplation, thinking about their answer to that question, and then the discussion will move on. So it's a great way of contributing and moving things forward without generating a lot of attention on you.
And that takes me back to my coaching client that I referred to earlier, who asked me the question about gravitas, because we were talking about gravitas, whether she had gravitas or didn't have gravitas. And she asked me quite directly what I thought gravitas was, how would I describe gravitas? And actually, that's a very powerful question. I found it very difficult to answer that question. As I said, I mumbled and muffled my way through, and I think I arrived at something that was the semblance of a reasonably intelligent answer. Her asking me that question actually elevated my view of her gravitas because she asked a very reaching, interesting, useful question.
Mhm.
So the act of asking questions that are perhaps a bit tricky for people to answer, but not in a trying to catch you out or a
Yeah.
cynical way, but more in a seeking to understand the topic in a better way, is actually demonstrating a certain type of gravitas.
And that is the same point, isn't it, about curiosity over judgment. I think gravitas lives. If we find it quite hard to pin down what gravitas is, then let's use some slightly more useful words. And I think
Mm.
curiosity is definitely one of those much more useful words.
Great. Great. I think that gravitas is one of those things we're going to keep coming back to because it is one of those overused terms that somehow we still really heavily rely on. And for good reason. We sort of instinctively know what we mean by it, but we
Mm.
don't necessarily actively know what we mean by it if you want to articulate it. So I think that it's going to be something that we'll come back to in future episodes. I'd love to know your views, dear listeners, on whether you have a better definition or even just something to offer that may help us reach a better definition of gravitas. Do drop us a line if you do.
We would love to hear from you. Drop us a DM on LinkedIn, Gemma Bullivant or Fiona Craig. I'm very formal on LinkedIn. I'm Fiona, but you can call me Fee.
Well, thanks for a really interesting conversation, Fee. I think, the key messages there are don't be afraid to ask questions and stay comfortable with the slight fear you might be feeling to go somewhere that's a little unknown. Give it a go.
Give it a go. It's like travel, isn't it? Let's go somewhere we don't quite know where we're going.
Oh, and we're back to the holiday again.
And we're back to the holiday. Did I mention I'm going on holiday again on Saturday? Did I mention that?
Thanks, Fee.
Bye, Jem. See you soon.
Bye.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to access more of our recordings. And if you think it'd be useful for someone else, please forward to them and leave a review. We base our content on questions we are regularly asked and what you want to know more about, so please do email us with any questions or comments to gemma@gemmabullivant.co.uk. And remember, you're already being more strategic than you realise.